From the 16th through the 18th centuries, the Spanish colonized Florida and the southeastern United States. They established missions to convert the native peoples to Christianity and enslave them. But some of those natives would fight back. Over in present-day Georgia, the powerful Creek Confederacy was formed, and they fought back against the Spanish and the British who came in. In the early 19th century, the U.S. government offered the Creeks a treaty that would force them west of the Mississippi River. Most of the Creeks signed this treaty, but a minority did not. This was partly because they hoped to win Creek support against the British. However, the Creek remained mostly neutral during the war. In 1790, the United States government attempted to annex the Creek territory in present-day Georgia. Creek leaders resisted, however, and war broke out. This conflict became known as the Creek War of 1791. These became known as the Lower Creeks, and soon after, the U.S. government would declare war on them. Starting the First Seminole War, they fled to Florida and joined forces with the Spanish. The Seminole people were led by a number of chiefs, including Osceola. He was a brilliant military leader who was able to inflict heavy casualties on the U.S. Army. One of his most famous victories was at the Battle of Okeechobee. In this battle, Osceola and his warriors ambushed a large force of U.S. troops and killed or captured nearly all of them. He was one of the most important leaders in Seminole history, and is remembered as a hero by his people. The state of Florida has a number of places named after him, including a county, a city, a river, and a battlefield. In 1817, these warriors, along with many others from other tribes, began raiding into Georgia and Florida. They have a number of casinos and other businesses that help them to support themselves. They also have a strong sense of community and identity. The Seminole people are an example of how a small group of people can stand up to a powerful government and win. They proved that it is possible to maintain your freedom and your land even in the face of overwhelming odds. This treaty forced the remaining Seminole to move to present-day Oklahoma. However, the U.S. government never took any steps to enforce the treaty. If you like our videos, then please hit that subscribe button. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. And so the Seminole remained free in Florida. The U.S. government saw this as an act of war and sent troops to put it down. This began the Third Seminole War. First, the U.S. government had already given away most of the land in Florida to the state of Florida. They were never again forced to move west of the Mississippi River. However, their way of life was changed forever. The Seminole people were now living in a time of peace, but they knew that it could change at any moment. They had proven that they were able to stand up to the might of the U.S. military and win, and so they were confident that they could defend themselves if necessary. This meant that there was no more land to give to the Seminoles. Additionally, the U.S. government had just come off of 2 costly wars with the Creek and didn't want to start another one. Finally, the U.S. military was simply not equipped to deal with the type of warfare the Seminole were using. The Seminole were masters of guerrilla tactics and were able to inflict heavy casualties on the U.S. Army. This type of warfare was something that the U.S. military was not trained to deal with, and they suffered heavy losses as a result. Here, they negotiated a treaty which ceded most of the Creek lands to the state of Georgia. This treaty forced the Creek to move west of the Alabama River. Although the war officially ended with the signing of the treaty, hostilities continued for several more years. Finally, in 1796, the war came to an end. The Seminole people are unique in that they are the only Native American tribe that never officially surrendered to the United States government. Together, they repelled numerous attacks by the United States Army and the state of Georgia. But in 1796, the two tribes went their separate ways. The Cherokee chose to sign a treaty ceding most of their land to the U.S. government in exchange for money and the right to keep their freedom. The Creek, however, wanted to keep their land and freedom. They refused to negotiate with the Americans and instead prepared to fight. After fighting 3 separate wars with the U.S. military, they were able to retain their land and maintain their freedom. The war was sparked by the United States' desire to acquire more land in Florida. Tensions had been high since the First War, and when the Americans sent troops into Creek territory, the Creek warriors were ready. The Creek fought alongside the British during the War of 1812, hoping to drive the Americans out of their territory. But when peace was declared, the Creek still refused to make peace with the U.S. government. Instead, they continued to resist. So let's learn how they did it. The Creek people were forced to flee their homeland and become refugees. They lived in swamps and forests, hiding from the U.S. Army. Eventually, the war came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814. This treaty forced the Creek to cede most of their remaining lands to the state of Alabama. Only a small portion of their territory was left untouched by the treaty. This became the home of the Creek people. Thanks for checking out another episode of Kings and Generals. Now let's go back to school and learn about the Creek people had been living in what is today the southeastern United States for thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived. In the 16th century, the Spanish began exploring and conquering the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast of North America. As they explored further inland, they encountered the Creek people and many others. This led to centuries of conflict between the Spanish colonial empire and the various native nations of the Southeast, including the Creeks. By the late 1700s, the Creek had developed into a large and powerful confederacy. It consisted of several dozen individual tribes and nations that spoke similar Muskogean languages and shared common cultural traits. By the end of the 18th century, the vast majority of the Creek people lived in present-day Alabama and Georgia. The Spanish recognized the threat the Creek posed to their colony in Florida. To combat this threat, the Spanish made allies with some of the other tribes in the Southeast, such as the Cherokee. They encouraged these allied tribes to attack the Creek, and this led to decades of constant warfare. During the Revolutionary War, the Spanish supported the Patriot cause. In 1792, a delegation of U.S. commissioners met with the Creek at a place now called the Indian Springs. In the meantime, the Creek had formed a strong alliance with the Cherokee. In 1813, the Second Seminole War broke out. The war was brutal and bloody. The Creek killed many Americans, but eventually, the U.S. military overwhelmed them. However, there were still some Creek warriors who refused to accept the treaty. The war lasted for 7 years and was one of the most brutal conflicts in American history. After years of fighting, the war came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paines, landing in 1822. So why did the U.S. government let the Seminoles stay in Florida? Well, there are a few reasons. After the Treaty of Paines landing, the Seminole people were able to maintain their freedom and keep their land. Osceola died in 1838 while imprisoned by the U.S. government. Today, the Seminole people are still living in Florida, and they continue to fight for their rights and their land. Thanks for watching another episode of Kings and Generals.